that's not ever going to go away.
All right, we're rolling.
Okay, and I want to ask you about SNAP too, because
Yes.
to me,
I was just about to mention
is
SNAP, yes.
key. SNAP has demanded all of this.
SNAP is key in this, and so is Voice of the Faithful.
Can you start again, just so that, are you rolling?
Rolling.
Okay.
SNAP is key in this, and so is Voice of the Faithful. Initially, I was in favor of Voice of the Faithful. I thought their motives were excellent. I thought they were looking to rally the laity to respond to this whole issue. There's a lot of tragic abuse, but there has also been an enormous amount of Catholic abuse of the Catholic abuse scandal, and SNAP and Voice of the Faithful are largely responsible for that. They have capitalized on a kind of rhetoric that has nothing to do with due process rights, and both groups have organized to deny any accused priest his due process rights. What exactly their agenda is, I don't know, but the church keeps capitulating to it. Just a few days ago, the Archdiocese of Boston capitulated to the demands of SNAP and bishopaccountability.org by publishing the names of every priest who has been accused, regardless of whether he's ever been convicted of a crime or even had due process in a court of law. Where I now live, there are prison inmates whose names are subject to being publicized under Megan's law. But every one of them has been convicted of a crime, whether justly or unjustly, rightly or wrongly, is beside the point. They've been convicted of a crime. In this publication of names, the bishops have organized and published their own private Megan's Law list without regard for whether the accused priest has ever been convicted of anything. And it's appalling. It's not Catholic, and it's appalling. And I believe there has been a presumption throughout that in every time that these people put such immense pressure on the bishops. I don't fault the bishops for being under this pressure. I fault them for caving into it at every turn. I think that they have a belief that once we get this monkey off our back, it'll stay off our back. But capitulating has simply empowered SNAP to continue and continue and continue. There was an incident on these stone walls. In fact, one of our readers really took this up. A woman by the name of Dorothy Stein. Dorothy Stein is not even Catholic, she's Jewish. Why she reads the blog, I don't know. She's fascinated by it. But she told me about an incident on CNN last October. There was a protest in Rome organized by SNAP, and some SNAP and VOTF people were there carrying picket signs. Anderson Cooper on CNN in October, I think it was October 31st, had in his evening talk show, had John Walsh, the host of America's Most Wanted, it's just been canceled. I did not see this, but Dorothy Stein saw it. She said that John Walsh looked at the camera and giving egregious examples of institutions just being clueless about child sexual abuse. John Walsh said to the camera, just last month, 100,000 victims of sex abuse by priests were denied an audience with the Pope to explain to him how their lives have been shattered. Well, this was CNN, this is global news. Dorothy Stein fired off a email to Anderson Cooper saying, you can't get away with this. There was a protest outside of St. Peter's Square involving 60 people, 60, not 100,000, though it's easy to confuse such numbers, she said. And she said, of the 60, I happen to know that 30 were claimed to be victims of sexual abuse. The other 30 were activists from SNAP and VOTF using the spotlight for some agenda of their own, and the so-called victims were outnumbered by reporters 2-1. How can you tell the world that there were 100,000 people there? And she received no reply, of course. So I wrote about this. I think there has been a sense on the part of the bishops who circled the wagons at some point that every time we pay, every time we publish a list, every time we capitulate, we're going to get them off our back. But every time it has empowered them further and further and further, to the point at which today any accused priest is across the board denied due process civilly, criminally, and canonically. And that's the sad part. What makes most of these cases credible is not evidence, it's settlement. Just the fact that it has been settled is what determines that the case is credible, and these priests are left in canonical limbo for decades.
It's a mess. It's a total mess, and the bishops don't get it.
The bishops don't get it, and in 2002, when the Dallas Charter was enacted, the bishops invited input from only one group, and that was SNAP. They heard only one side of the story, and there has been no other side of the story said since. And any time there's an attempt to address another side of the story, SNAP goes on the attack. SNAP left me alone entirely, never even noticed me, never had a word to say about me, nothing, until I wrote an article called Due Process for Accused Priests for the Catholic League, and all of a sudden David Clohessy issued a statement that I am a dangerous and demented man. If I'm dangerous to his agenda, then that's a good thing, because his agenda has become critically anti-Catholic. And why the bishops capitulate to it is a mystery to me. I think they're locked into a course of conduct and don't know what else to do. Detective McLaughlin is a crusader. I don't know what else to say about him. He has prosecuted many priests. He's investigated many. I have a photograph of him that someone sent me standing in front of a cake, and had the number 350 on it, on the cake, and he has a little spatula and he's smiling. The cake was a celebration of his 350th arrest, posing as a 14-year-old boy cruising the internet looking for sexual encounters with adult men. He went on from prosecuting real cases of abuse to the internet crimes. Now, a part of me understands what he's doing and agrees with it, even that men who are lured to Keene, New Hampshire with the intent of having sex with teenagers that they meet online should be prosecuted. But not one of those cases has gone to trial. Not one of those cases has ever been tested. In every single instance, he offers a plea deal that the accused ends up playing the game and taking. And so none of these tactics are ever examined. In one article I read about him, written by a Boston Globe writer, he said that it's my job to ferret the criminal element out of society. And he said, I'll go as far as I can until some judge tells me that I can go no further. And those are scary statements from a police officer whose job is to uphold the law, not just to prosecute crime. I believe he had as much of a responsibility to investigate this case as he did to present it in court. And instead of investigate, he choreographed it and enabled the accusers every step of the way. Why? I could not begin to tell you. I will say this. One of the accusers has, in my case, has recanted. And this is something that's about to become public. I'm assuming that it will be by the time you actually end up.
I won't be done.
Yes.
This won't be until next summer.
Okay.
At the earliest.
Yeah. One of the accusers in my case has recanted, and he told an incredibly disturbing story of being called to a meeting and offered an enormous amount of money if he would join my accusers in corroborating their accusations against me. He refused, and the pressure that he was under was pretty enormous. And he was actually told by somebody who's pretty high profile in this case, think of your wife and kids. You know, I know you're broke. I know you've got a history. I know you're a drug addict. This money could mean a lot to them. And so he said, I was left believing that all I had to do was say what they were saying, and I would get a check and nothing else. I would have to do nothing else. He claimed that he agreed to this at the meeting. And who all was at that meeting, I'm not aware yet, but there's an investigator involved who is aware of this.
Is that Jim? Jim Abbott?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've spoken to Jim very briefly, and I'll talk with you about him.
He said that the next day he received a subpoena to testify before a grand jury for a new indictment, which tells me that both the police detective and the prosecutor were both aware that this man was being bribed into an accusation. He said he brought the subpoena to the county attorney's office.
This is Jim?
No, this is the young man who was accusing me, who was presented with a bribe. He was given an amount of cash and a promise that he would obtain an enormous amount of money in a claim against the diocese. He agreed to it, was given a subpoena to testify in front of a grand jury for a new indictment. On the morning of the testimony before the grand jury, he showed up at the prosecutor's office and told a secretary, I've been up all night, I know what's going on here. This man did nothing but help me, and I'm not going to be part of this. She took the subpoena and walked into an office, and then 5 minutes later walked out and said, we won't need anything further from you. He left, and he kept that to himself until recently. I know that Detective McLaughlin approached him with this deal, not the other way around. So now I'm left to wonder who else got such a deal and who else was approached. We don't know how any of these people ended up in front of Detective McLaughlin. But there are other details in this whole picture that are disturbing. The mother of the three Grover brothers was at that time a sex abuse investigator for Child Protective Services for the state. And as such, she was aware of elements of other cases involving other priests that had been settled quietly over the years, and this stuff shouldn't have happened, but it did happen. Both the state and the church agreed to these settlements. It wasn't like the church was covering something up and hiding it from civil authorities. That's not true. She was a social worker investigating some of these cases for the state. When her sons accused me, all of the accusations contained elements of these stories involving other priests, and no one investigated them. And it was as if that was telling the diocese, you stay out of this, because if you come to his defense, then this floodgate opens. What happened in 2002 would have happened in New Hampshire in 1994, because there would have been a floodgate of accusations. The other priest who was accused by the same brothers fled the state and refused when we attempted to subpoena him to testify at my trial. He left the state, and nobody's ever heard from him. He has never denied the accusations against him, even though he wasn't there. We simply asked him to come forward and deny that this took place. He did not. We did find a series of checks written on parish accounts from him to each of these accusers, but they were years later when the accusers were 16, 17, 18 years old. He never explained this. Jim Abbott found him 2 years ago, living in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and he agreed to an interview, and he was very nervous over the phone. Jim said he heard another man in the background saying to him, Steve, if this is something that's going to help Gordon, I think you should do it.
Oh, wonderful.
We never knew who that was. We don't know who that was. They arranged a date to be interviewed. All we wanted Steve Scruton to do was either affirm or deny his involvement in this. And on the day of the interview, Jim came all the way up from New York and Father Scruton refused to open the door. He said, I've consulted with somebody and I can't be interviewed. I wrote him a letter, and I have that letter, detailing the claims against him by the same people who accused me. I asked him to reconsider by telling the simple truth. And 2 days after receiving that letter, Father Scruton had a mysterious fall down a flight of stairs at some therapist's office in Boston and never regained consciousness and died in January of last year. So he took the truth with him, and we have been able to find out nothing. There was no obituary, there was no traditional notice of any kind. He was buried in his priestly vestments. The diocese had claimed for all these years that they had no idea of his whereabouts. He was hiding right in plain sight. So
That's so bizarre.
it's bizarre. There's a lot that's bizarre
I know,
here.
the whole thing.
And getting to the bottom of it from inside here is very difficult. It has taken a long, long time.
Well, do you feel frustrated? I mean, are you hopeful?
There were times that were very frustrating. In 2000 and 2001, I had really obtained the interest of the Wall Street Journal and Dorothy Rabinowitz about the case. She was investigating. I had sent her boxes of materials and documents that I had found, and some even by accident. And then in January of 2002, I received a letter from her telling me that, unfortunately, everything you sent us, everything we've researched, everything I have produced was destroyed in the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, because their office was right across the street, and their offices were obliterated that day. It was the least of that tragedy, but it just sent me so far back into the abyss. I began all over again, accumulating everything. It's so difficult because I have this much space here to keep files and documents here. I started all over again. It took me a while. And then just as I began to get it underway, Bishop McCormick, my bishop, came to visit me, and he made an offer to me that he and the diocese would invest $40,000 into hiring a lawyer to investigate my situation on the condition that I challenge only the sentence and not the convictions. And then, right on the heels of that, the great scandal out of Boston erupted, implicating him, because he was their personnel director, and that was the end of his overture. And then that cast me back into the abyss again. And it took several more years to wait for that to calm down enough to get someone to look at this matter.
How have you survived all this?
By losing my hair, for the most part. I came in here with a full head of hair.
Yeah, tell me about it.
I don't know. In 2009, I received a message from a woman in Australia who was a devout Catholic. And she said, I've been reading about you here and there, the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. She said, you really need a blog. You need me to set up a blog for you. Well, prisoners don't have blogs. And so I found someone, Charlene in Indiana, who was a retired State Department diplomat. Wonderful, wonderful woman. And both of these women are just amazing. And we set up something. All I have here is an old typewriter. I type an article and send it to Charlene. Charlene scans it. We do some editing over the telephone. I'm charged 15 cents a minute. On my commissary account for phone calls, we edit. I keep a copy, send her a copy. We do the editing. She emails it to Australia, and it's posted on these stone walls, rather. And it's just amazing. The first month these stone walls came out, in July of 2009, we had 42 readers. 6 months later, we had 42,000. And it's just blossomed. And I can count on one hand the number of toxic comments that we have had to reject, which tells me that there's a whole church out there ready and willing and able to hear that there's another side of this story. They're just waiting for someone to tell it.
Right. That's what I want to do. How do you mobilize people? You know, because I've been preaching about this, and at first people were saying, I don't want to hear about it, don't talk about it. And now people have been, the ship is turning slowly.
The ship is turning slowly while it's sinking slowly, at least in terms of material assets. And since 2002, it's topped $2 billion in settlements nationwide, mediated settlements, not jury awards, mediated settlements that are granted with no offer of proof whatsoever. It's just payout after payout after payout, and it cannot possibly be in service to the church. It cannot even possibly still be in service to the victims of abuse, the legitimate victims of abuse. This is one of the things that has really encouraged me recently. Just recently, these stone walls has attracted a few victims of sexual abuse by priests who are themselves alarmed at the proliferation of false accusations and demoralized by it. One man just left a message on his Facebook page that he is from the Boston area. He is a victim of sexual abuse by a priest, and he obtained a settlement, and he will always stand beside what he did and what his motives were and the healing process that he entered into. But after reading these stone walls, he is completely demoralized at what this tale of victimhood has become, because he doesn't believe 50% of the accusations that he's reading. And in good conscience, he says he now has to make a statement, and he has come forward saying that he cannot live with himself in his own recovery if he does not do everything in his power to help me, because he believes that the case against me was a fraud. And he said, it isn't in my name. This SNAP is not going to be speaking in my name for this.
Good for him. It's about time we need that. We really need this break from SNAP and their narrative that they push.
He's not the only one. There are several others, and that's the most encouraging thing that I have seen. That they feel that true advocacy involves calling the victims to healing, not to vengeance. And this is just a state of perpetual vengeance, never ending. And that is not advocacy. That's something very toxic. And so I give this man credit for what he's doing. I think he's incredibly honest with himself. And I welcome his participation in it.
What about your family? What's our time?
We have about 40 minutes.
Oh, good. Great.
Okay.
Plenty of time.
I grew up in the Boston area. You know, it's interesting. I just finished a book last weekend called Faith by Jennifer Hay, Haigh. It is an incredible novel. It's just recently published this year, and it's about a Boston priest who was accused in 2002. In the height of the big explosion in Boston, he's accused in a current case. He's innocent of the accusation. The accusation was motivated by what was in the headlines and by money. But just the story of what happened to him, how everyone in the archdiocese precluded his guilt, how his family distanced themselves from him. This was the story of my life. A friend of mine even sent her publisher a message and saying, do you want to meet Father Breen? Father Arthur Breen is the protagonist in her story. Go to www.thestonewalls.com, and I understand she's been looking at the site. The story could be my autobiography, but my family has stood by me from somewhat of a distance. I have two brothers and a sister. One brother has not spoken to me since the day I was accused, and there's been no explanation, no nuancing, nothing. And it's pretty amazing that in Jennifer Hay's novel, that happens to the priest there too. His sister stands by him. His brother ceases to speak, to even acknowledge his existence, and that's a very painful thing. what makes it more painful for my family and for me? When I first came in here, my sister and her husband and my nieces visited me weekly. Every Sunday morning they trudged up here from Boston. And after a few months, I had to tell them, you can't do this every week. This can't be your Sunday every week. I can't permit this. So we now visit once or twice a year, and I talk to them weekly on the telephone. My nieces have grown up. I'm a stranger to them today. They were little girls when I came in here 17 years ago. Now they're married with families of their own, and they have moved on, and I have let them move on and encouraged them to move on. But my sister and my brother-in-law and my younger brother stand by me, and we talk frequently, and I know they read the blog. My younger brother leaves comments occasionally. He's horrified sometimes by what he reads. And that's about as much family support as I need. My sister has an issue, and I understand where she's coming from in this, in that she feels that as her brother, I am a priest who knew thousands of people. Everyone seemed to count on me in her view. Everyone wanted something from me. I was like in the center of a large aquarium all the time. And then somebody dropped something really nasty into the water and everyone fled. And I was all alone. She wonders what happened to the thousands of parishioners and others who knew me, who trusted me, who counted on me, and then all of a sudden, in one day's time, in one headline's time, no longer knew me. I've also been in prison for 17 years, 15 miles from the Chancery office of my diocese, and I have never been visited by a priest of my diocese. And I have no explanation for that. I know that diocesan officials have said, whenever this comes up, excuse me, that early on in my incarceration, I told them through unnamed third parties that I do not want to see anyone from my diocese. That's not true. That has never taken place. And I have never been told who these third parties are. But now so much time has gone by that there is simply no longer a spiritual connection between us. I stepped out a couple of years ago. There was a priest in my diocese who wrote an op-ed piece for one of the local newspapers, and he was advocating for a change in canon law so that every priest accused could be summarily laicized by his bishop rather than wait for the long, interminable process in Rome. This man was taking the position that the best way to avoid being targeted by a witch hunt is to join it. So I wrote him a letter, and it was a friendly letter, and I said, you know, I read what you wrote, and I take issue with it, and I'm asking you, as a brother priest, from the point of view of the accused, to present a case for why I believe the canonical rights of priests must be protected in these decades-old claims. A week later, I got a bigger envelope from him, and I opened it up, and inside was my letter, unopened, with a post-it note that said, "Communications with you are neither prudent nor welcomed." I was furious. I was appalled. I was hurt. I was stifled. Stifled was the worst part about this. But you know, I've written about this, but I have never revealed his name, and I won't reveal his name. I feel an obligation to protect my brother priests from scandal, even when they're the cause of the scandal. Other people have been appalled at this information. I don't know how to connect with some of them. There's one who recently wrote to me. He's a retiree from my diocese, and he said, you know, his letter was kind of comical. He's lived outside the diocese for years. He was kind of known as a rebel over the years, and he wrote me a letter out of the blue, and he said, you know, I've been reading your stuff, and he said, you support the Catholic League, which I despise, and you despise voice of the faithful, which I like. How dare you? So I wrote him back and told him, well, I'm only telling the truth here, and we went back and forth. And he now wants to visit me.
Yeah, I like Bill Donahue.
I like Bill Donahue
I think
too.
he's a rough and tumble Irishman. I like him.
Bill Donahue wrote me a letter one day, and he said, I got a call from a prominent Catholic writer who is trying to dissuade me from taking up your cause. And he said, I told the writer that I am convinced by the evidence that you know about and evidence that you don't know about. And I give Bill Donahue a lot of credit.
Yeah, I think he stands up.
He
for the
does.
truth.
He
I
does.
think He really is interested in the truth.
He's very interested in the truth. He's also seeing something now that I have been screaming from whatever rooftop is available to me for about 10 years. And that is these financial and other capitulations are not in the best interest of the church.
Right.
It's a whole other kind of cover-up.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a whole nother scandal. The money that's flowing out. You brought up the aquarium analogy, and all these thousands of people who loved you and trusted you, then they just disappear like mist in the sky. That so has bothered me since 2002 as a priest. I'm so ticked at the Catholic laity. Like, what do you make of that? That one day you're trusted and loved, and then all of a sudden the next day it's disappeared like it never was. Was it real? Like,
That's all it takes.
I asked myself, was any of this real to any of you people?
In a sense, we're a tabloid culture. This News of the World scandal in London, it kind of caught my attention. That I don't just blame the newspaper, I blame its readers.
Right.
The people who bought into this, what kind of dirt can we get on anyone, today?
Right. Right. It is a whole culture. It's our whole culture.
We want the dirt, and the media has obliged, and they simply give us what we're willing to buy.
Right. Right.
And I don't blame the Boston Globe Spotlight team.
I do.
I do in the sense that a Spotlight investigation is just that. It leaves all the rest of the details in darkness and focuses an intense light in one place that's often out of context, and this was out of context.
Yeah, I confronted Walter V. Robinson twice on the telephone. John was in the office about Shanley, and he didn't do it. And Walter said, "Oh, I know."
Yes, he does know. I wrote to Robinson several years ago. There was a case involving a young man who was accusing a Boston priest. I was aware that the case was a fraud. The young man was here in this prison with me, and he approached me one day and asked me, he had been visited by his attorney. This was interesting. This is an interesting story.
Talk about this process.
This young man's name was Randy. He was in his 30s, early 30s, exuded charm. He was a con artist. He was in prison for being a con artist. He was not somebody who was in my circle of friends, which is pretty small in prison. But he showed up at my cell door one day, and he said, big smile, a smile that could sell a used car to anyone. And he said, I was just visited by my lawyer. And I said, really, Randy? And he said, yes, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay, well, talk. He said, my lawyer asked me if I'm a Catholic, and I told him, well, sort of, I used to be. And he said, my lawyer asked me if I've ever had a problem with a priest. This was 2002. He said, I knew immediately where this was going. And my lawyer said, if you want to accuse a priest of something, I can put 50 grand in your account by the end of this year. $100,000 settlement, split 50-50. All I need you to do is come up with a name, a couple of details, and a place. And so Randy said, I told the lawyer, he wouldn't tell me who the lawyer was. I told the lawyer that there just happens to be a priest on my pod in prison who's here and after being accused. And the lawyer said, this is great because they have access to directories. They said, there's this big directory of Catholics and he could probably get it. And so Randy wanted me to help him find the name of a priest who might have been in his childhood community 20 years earlier. Any priest. Preferably someone dead, or at least somebody who's got dementia, somebody who can't really deny it. But it doesn't matter whether they deny it. So I told Randy was offering me a finder's fee from the attorney. He said, this is a win-win situation all around. And I said, well, yes, except for the poor priest who you're about to accuse. And he said, well, that's why we want a dead one. You pick a dead one and there's no harm, no foul. Well, obviously I refused this deal. And Randy got out of prison. The next thing I know, Randy's accusing a Boston priest, and he's got a settlement pending. The Globe reported this. I wrote to the Globe writer, and I wrote to the Archdiocese of Boston and said that I have evidence that this is a fraud. Neither one of them responded. The Archdiocese settled the case. Same thing happened here in New Hampshire. A young man in here, this whole scam has not been lost on prison inmates. I'm amazed sometimes at the honesty around me. This is the place where, if you really want a view of the Catholic sex abuse scandal, this is the place to go for it. Because these guys see right through it. Right through it. They see it. I floated something one day to some prisoners who were talking to me. I said, in my estimation, about a third of these claims are false. And they all said, no, I don't agree. It's at least half, maybe more. This is just, I know these people. They said, this is a scam. And we're all wondering why we're not getting into it. And many inmates have attempted to. I've been approached at least a dozen times from inmates who want to know if I would give them the name of a priest in their childhood community. And the deal's already made. Their lawyers have already consented to this, that we'll bring it, write a letter, get a settlement, no questions are asked. This is tragic. Meanwhile, I don't know if you've ever read Pornchai's story online.
No.
It's on these stone walls under commentary. Pornchai's my roommate in this prison for the last 3 years. It's an amazing story, an absolutely incredible story. It's a very public story now, but Pornchai is 38 years old. He spent 13 years in Maine State Prison's Supermax unit, 13 years, locked up 24 hours a day because he was dangerous. He exuded anger. Pornchai murdered a man at the age of 18 and was given a 45-year sentence. And he's been in prison since he was 18. Pornchai was taken against his will from Thailand when he was 11 years old, just literally plucked out of Thailand and brought here for illicit purposes. And yet, this has gone on in this kid's life, and nobody has even taken casual notice of it. And yet he has had to witness this unfolding clergy sex abuse story where if somebody says some priest touched me funny 30 years ago, I'm going to be a victim and I'm going to be excused from my own failed life and I'm going to be given a lucrative check. And I can't explain this to Pornchai in ways that he can understand. He converted to Catholicism last year after reading the story of St. Maximilian Kolbe. He took the name Maximilian as his confirmation name. He's completely transformed his life. But what happened to him is unspeakable. And he has witnessed the unfolding of the sex abuse story involving the Catholic Church from afar with horror. That anyone can just pick up the phone and say, this priest touched me, and be handed $50,000. And Pornchai is going to spend the rest of his life in prison because of what somebody else visited upon his life. And this place is filled with people like this. So they see the sex abuse scandal very differently. And they wonder when the church is going to wake up. And they wonder when the rest of society is going to wake up. You know, Pornchai spent his childhood living with a man who exploited him, and he's now living with me. Do you think for an instant that this kid would be willing to live with a predator? As he writes it, I know predators, and he does not believe that I am one. His story is just horrific. And
there is so much abuse. That's the tragedy in all this.
this prison is built around abuse.
Yeah, right.
And
then there's this crazy, creepy Catholic Church story that it's just. I've done a couple films in Central Europe and about the communist persecution of Christians, and especially the Catholic Church, and this is kind of like it.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, where they came up with all this stuff, and they did the same thing. They accused priests of anything, and they printed in the papers. And I mean, basically, if you were a Catholic and known, you had no rights. And that's what's happened here in these short 12 years. That has happened here in this country. And the bishops are playing patty cake with Snap and the people that are causing this.
They're afraid, and Snap is given the loudest, last voice in any newspaper coverage of the scandal.
No matter what.
Even the Wall Street Journal has done this, and I have called them on it. I have written to journal reporters who have done this, who have written anything about the Pope, anything that comes up. The last paragraph is an interview with David Clohessy.
Who always says the church has not done enough.
The church has not done enough, the church has done nothing, the
Right.
church has changed nothing.
Right, yeah.
This is leaving victim, he has a can, and they give him the last word, and I called them on it, and they stopped doing it. They actually stopped doing it. I actually saw a Wall Street Journal article about the sex abuse scandal in Europe, and David Clohessy is not even mentioned, or Barbara Blaine, not even mentioned in it. I'm amazed it's happened finally, but I think I embarrassed them into it.
Good. I hope somebody does.
It's ridiculous.
Because the media's in on it. That's what ticks me off with the Globe and the New York Times. They are in on it. Like, as you said, Lori whatever her name, she was in Rome while Snap was there. Why is Laura Goodstein in Rome at the same exact time that Snap is there? Obviously, they're working together.
Yes.
Obviously, and Anderson was there because there was the bishop from Belgium. It was all connected.
Exactly.
You know. It's just mind-boggling. Anything else? This is great. I mean, we've got so much to work with. So I'm going to contact Dorothy. Is it okay to speak to Jim or Jim Abbott?
It is in a sense, but be aware that
yeah,
he's limited on what.
Right, and so he told me that, but he wanted me to ask you, can I speak to him?
Yes, and I will tell him yes.
Yeah, okay, just, right,
Sure.
and everything can be off the record until, now when's your case coming up, or what? Can you
I don't know, we're off the record.
Yep.
I just received finally an appellate brief that's been 2 years in the making. I have a very good attorney in New York City who has taken this case, and we've been involved in fundraising, trying to keep it going. That's been the biggest obstacle. Jim Abbott has tremendous credentials as a
former FBI.
40 years as special agent supervisor in charge of covert operations for the New York region of the FBI. It's a little hard to top that kind of investigatory credential. Jim has spent 2 years and over 1,000 hours in direct investigation of the case. He has interviewed everyone who would agree to speak to him. None of the accusers would agree to speak with him. But
except for this one.
And some of the family members of others.
Oh, that might be helpful.
It has been helpful.
It could
Yeah.
really
There's been an
be.
enormous amount of information that has surfaced.
I hope you can go after this.
And so,
McLaughlin.
well, McLaughlin, I believe, is a very dangerous man.
It sounds like.
Not just to me, but to others. And he's a crusader, and I think his target was never me. It was the Catholic Church.
Right.
It didn't matter which priests he
Right.
brought down.
Right.
He took great personal pleasure and a sense of accomplishment in destroying so far I'm the fourth priest that he has investigated, yes.
What about Brennan, the judge? Do you think he
I don't really have an
biased?
explanation for Brennan. I believe he was biased. Well, in a sense, this is one thing I have been able to ascertain. The mother of the accusers was, as I said, a sex abuse investigator for Child Protective Services in New Hampshire. At the time of my trial, she was present in the courtroom, even testifying as the aggrieved mother of 4 young men who trusted their priest and were raped by him, in her story and worldview. I didn't realize this until the very end of the trial, but she wept one day on the stand, recounting how she and her sons had come to trust me and how she was oblivious to all of this that was happening. And then one day, on that day after she testified, there was a short break, and a lawyer who had been present in the courtroom but not involved in the case walked up to me in the men's room outside in the lobby. I was still a free man then. And, he said, "You know, there's something really strange going on here." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "You know, she testifies in this court, in front of this judge all the time. And she's always cool, calm, collected, succinct, and precise. No matter how horrible or horrific what she's saying." And it dawned on me, she and this judge know each other. She has testified in his court as a state's witness on numerous sexual assault cases as the representative of Child Protective Services. And now here she is in his presence as the victim. How can this be? And I was never able to get an answer to that question. Then it also turns out that I'm not the first person her son, the one at trial, Thomas, accused. He also accused her husband of sexual abuse. His adoptive, these brothers were all adopted, his adopted father. I understand at some point he recanted it after accusing me, but we were never made aware of that. This was news to me. It turned out that in a treatment program for his drug addiction, he claimed on the witness stand that he told his therapist that I sexually abused him. The therapist, who could not really direct herself to this during the trial because of confidentiality issues, has since ascertained that he did not accuse me, that the person he accused was his own adopted father, and that the only time he ever used my name was in his discharge contract. He wrote my name as his choice of contact person in sobriety. And she said there's no way we would have let that go by if he was accusing him. But that somehow never ended up in front of the jury. And that's the other issue, is that sex abuse claimants are seen as victims throughout the system from day one. And so their reputation is protected and their name is protected. I believe that the only reason I have not been continually subjected to false claims by people I do not even know is that it became clear that their names were going to be publicized. All of a sudden it halted in my regard, but not in regard to most other priests. So I have encouraged priests that if the accusation is in fact false, you must publicize the name of your accuser in whatever way possible. If the media won't do it, find another way to do it. Write a blog post, something. Because that's the only thing that's going to stop this tidal wave, is when false accusers are exposed.
Do you think the mother believes it? What kind of dynamic do you think is going on there?
I don't know.
If you saw her in the street, let's say you're successful, you get out, if you saw her, what would you say?
You know, it's funny, I've dreamed of that. I've dreamed that I've been outside of prison and ran into her on the street and said, you know, it isn't true, it was never true. You know that, right? And she gives me a look in the dream as if to say, well, yeah, but it ends right there. Nothing is ever said. I don't know what she believes. I don't know. You know, there was a story, there was an incident involving her family. It's actually at the time I first met her family. I was driving through her town. I was actually stationed, I spent a summer internship in a neighboring community. I was driving through her town. It was a little town called Marlborough, just outside of Keene, New Hampshire. One of her sons was in the street flagging down a car, and I was the car. I pulled over and I asked him what was wrong. He said his little brother drowned in their pool, and he can't get help. So I pulled into the side street. I pulled into their driveway. I went to their backyard with him, and there were 3 or 4 of her teenage kids there, and they had a 6-year-old boy, a little African-American boy. These were African-American and Native American adopted kids. He was on the ground and pale, and the next-door neighbor was a nurse, and she was trying to revive him. And I asked her how long she had been trying, and she said a couple of minutes, and she was very frightened that she had lost him. And she had the boy on his back, and she was trying to give him mouth-to-mouth, but she was getting no air in him, and I realized that his abdomen was distended. So I grabbed him and turned him over and squeezed, and the water came gushing out of his mouth and lungs. And then I smacked him in the buttocks, and he started to cry, and it cleared his lungs. It wasn't a hard smack, but it saved his life. And the nurse said, "That's about the most incredible thing I've ever seen." She said, I never even thought of that. It's done in childbirth to clear the lungs. And he started coughing and choking, and this town had a volunteer ambulance crew. And I stayed there with him until it took 90 minutes to get the ambulance there. Got him to the hospital, and the doctors told his mother that I had saved his life by this. And she thanked me, and we became friends. She presented in court that I used this incident to infiltrate myself into her family, to take advantage of her sons. And that to me was the most hideous part of all of their testimony, was that statement, that I was presented in as being subhuman in that way. And I don't know what she's thinking. I don't know how she justifies it. I know that money talks, and money spoke very loudly in this case. And there are, again, aspects of the money involved that I think are going to come out in time, and the role that it played, but it played a predominant role here.
Wow, what a wonderful interview. I think we have a lot to work with, and I really appreciate your willingness to trust me, and I'm hoping for the best, that I can make a compelling, argument that there are lots, and I agree, I think there's 50%. And I told that to Robinson, and that's why he refused to speak to me on camera. He said, "I only believe there's a few reasons." And I said, "I think there's 50% at least."
Yeah. The Globe doesn't want to be in a position of having to take any of this back.
No, they will not take any of it back,
So
but I'm going to try. Because I'm going to, at least, I need to say, they declined to give me an interview. I need to be in that, so I can almost already say that.
Okay.
But
what if we give Mr. Lyons a break here?
He's pacing.
Glaring at me out there.
Okay.